Can a good person become evil because of their surrounding environment? To try and answer this question, a professor from one of the most important universities in the United States decided to conduct a social experiment. He brought students to participate in a practical exercise for 2 weeks. But what could have been just another academic study on human behavior ended up involving the police, people being chained, torture practices, and had to be dramatically halted before a tragedy occurred. This is the story of the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Hey, Pedro here. This video you are watching was originally in Portuguese, my native language. This is the attempt of our team to translate it to English, and I sincerely hope you enjoy it. Your feedback is extremely important to us. Now, back to the video.
The story I'm going to tell in this video takes place in August 1971. But to understand the context in which all this happened, we need to go even further back in time and swap the sunny summer of California for the harsh winter of Germany. But we are at the very end of the year 1945 in Nuremberg. World War II had finally come to an end. The horror inflicted by the Nazis had finally come to an end, and it was time for the reckoning. And for this reason, the United States, Soviet Union, France, and the United Kingdom, the Allied countries that won the war, decided to create a court to judge the crimes by the Nazis. It was the famous Nuremberg Trials. Some of the main commanders of the regime were not tried. And that's because at war's end, many decided to seal their fates and ended their own lives. It then fell to the newly formed court to judge representatives just below them, like ministers, businessmen, and ideologues of Nazism. And the reason why I bring up the Nuremberg trials here is because during the trial, many of the defendants presented a very similar line of defense. That they committed all those atrocities simply because they were following orders from their superiors. Well, their defense didn't do much good because almost all of them were convicted. But this defense strategy caught the attention of Professor Stanley Milgram from Yale University. He was Jewish, and his life was directly affected by the Holocaust, so he decided to test the defendants' arguments at Nuremberg. And in the early 60s, he began what became known as the MGRM Experiment. The idea was to find out to what extent humans can become cruel simply by following orders from a superior. The test worked more or less like this. 40 people were called to participate supposedly in a study about memory. Each volunteer was taken to a room along with a test supervisor, while an actor was taken to an adjacent room. This actor pretended to be a subject who would have their memory tested. They were supposed to memorize a list of words, but deliberately made some mistakes. And then, for every mistake made, the supervisor would ask the volunteer to press a button to administer shocks of varying intensities to the poor person in the other room. The weakest would be 15 volts and the strongest 450 volts. But in reality, the shock was entirely fake. The actor was just screaming to pretend it was hurting, but the volunteer administering the shock didn't know that. If they refused to administer the shock, the supervisor would insist 3 more times, just to see if at any point the volunteer would be convinced to commit that cruelty. The result? Absolutely everyone, without a single exception, pressed the shock button at some point, including the high-intensity options up to 300 volts, with 2/3 of them going beyond, reaching the maximum voltage of 450 volts. And most justified themselves by saying they were just doing what the experiment leader told them to do. Well, it's a shocking result. But at least in this experiment, no one suffered any real harm. It was all a simulation, very different from what would happen years later at a university on the other side of the United States. And that's why from Yale in Connecticut, we finally go to Stanford in California. Inspired by Milgram's work, psychologist and professor Philip Zimbardo decided to go further in the search for answers about obedience and human evil. And in the early 70s, he put into practice what is still considered one of the most infamous and cruelest tests in the history of psychology, the Stanford Prison Experiment. It started with an announcement on university walls and in local newspapers. The proposal? $15 a day for the dedicated volunteer who agreed to spend 2 weeks in a simulated prison. And it's worth noting $15 more than 50 years ago had a very different real value than today. Considering inflation in the US over this period, this equals about $110. If we take into account the whole period of the Stanford experiment, it would come down to more than $1,000 to spend 2 weeks of vacation in a fake prison, help advance science, and even earn extra credit hours in college. In total, 75 young men applied. The 24 who were chosen were divided into 2 groups, the jailers and the prisoners. To decide who would be in which group, the researchers resorted to the advanced scientific technique of random vertical coin tossing, also known as heads or tails. In other words, a game of chance sealed the fate of all those people. They were very different destinies. To start, the guards were simply asked to show up at the university to participate in the experiment. The prisoners were literally arrested. As a first sign of the bizarre events that were about to unfold, the local police agreed to participate in the experiment and went to pick up each volunteer from their homes one by one. They were handcuffed and transported in a patrol car with their eyes blindfolded towards the fake prison built in the basement of the university itself. The campus was practically deserted due to summer vacation in the United States. It was the perfect setting to create a sense of isolation. Empty rooms, one next to the other, were transformed into cells. Everything was thought out in detail to make the experience as realistic as possible. The guards, for example, were given uniforms, sunglasses, and batons. The prisoners, upon arrival, had to get completely naked and were disinfected with a spray. And then they were given some rag, like a loose shirt without any underwear, a pair of rubber sandals, and a nylon cap to make it look like they had their heads shaved. And they were also forced to wear a chain around their ankles the entire time. All this aimed at stripping away each person's identity, transforming everyone into a single mass without individualities. That's why the prisoners were deprived of their names. They were identified only by a number that was written on each of their uniforms. And that was just the start of the humiliation they'd face in the coming days. From there, things only worsened, in an escalation of tension becoming more severe every moment. The guards were directed that physical violence was not allowed, and I strongly emphasize the word physical, because this meant that other forms of violence, such as psychological, were permitted, and it didn't take long for them to start putting this into practice. When they realized they were in a higher hierarchical position, even if only fictitiously, the jailers made it a point to show who was in charge. At first it was mockery, over time humiliations, and then complete sadism, that is, the pleasure of causing suffering. They began to dictate arbitrary rules of behavior. They demanded how they wanted to be treated and how the prisoners should act. Screaming and insults became a daily routine. If a prisoner ever disobeyed an order, they were punished immediately, sometimes with push-ups, other times with sit-ups, and sometimes being forced to sing a song or two. Everything was extremely disrespectful, solely with the intention of mocking the group of prisoners. Another common way to annoy the inmates was by waking them up in the middle of the night, taking everyone to the hallway, and conducting a roll call. Moreover, sleep deprivation is a classic torture technique, and coupled with the fact that there were no windows or clocks in the cells, it caused the prisoners to quickly lose track of time. And there was the lack of basic needs. Whenever they saw fit, the guards stopped the prisoners from going to the bathroom. Often they were forced to use a bucket in front of everyone. And another technique to stress the environment was to mix the inmates from each cell, making communication between them difficult, or even offer different treatments for the obedient and the disobedient, increasing the spirit of rivalry among the prisoners themselves. The old divide and conquer. With so many ways to strain the atmosphere, it was expected things would come to a boiling point. And that's exactly what happened. Prisoners outraged by the situation started to rebel. They rioted in their cells, and the guards fired fire extinguishers at them to control the rebellion. Another form of punishment was solitary confinement, a small space where troublemakers were thrown and remained in the dark for hours. One of the prisoners who was taken to solitary received the punishment because he started a hunger strike. He was forced to stay inside holding the sausages he refused to eat. He was only allowed to leave when Philip Zimbardo, the study's lead, decided to intervene. In fact, that was just one of the moments when the researcher directly interfered with what was happening in those rooms. This was because he was watching the experiment through a camera, as if it were a kind of big brother of the prison. On the fourth day, for example, after hearing a rumor about a possible escape plan, he even asked the local police to transfer the entire experiment to an actual but deactivated prison block. However, the police refused because there are limits to everything. The experiment continued at the university, and the prisoners' desire to leave that place remained as well. But upon learning that they would not receive a single cent if they quit halfway, almost everyone agreed to continue living that nightmare. Almost. 2 students couldn't withstand the pressure and left the test at some point, and with that, gradually, the experiment began to crumble. The prisoners who remained felt even more desolate. Crying fits became increasingly common. The humiliations only increased, and the fights became very frequent. Hostility kept growing between the two groups, and chaos began to reign in the environment. The fear was that a tragedy could happen at any moment, and that's why, after much resistance, Professor Zimbardo chose to abort the experiment. The project, which was supposed to take 14 days, lasted only 6. One of the people who led Zimbardo to suspend that chaos was researcher Christina Maslar, who was his girlfriend at the time. But despite the experiment coming to an end, the controversies surrounding everything that unfolded that week at Stanford were just beginning. Zimbardo came under criticism for ethical issues. After all, can a researcher subject human beings to such degrading situations? Imagine the trauma for those college students in the experiment. Moreover, in the last few decades, evidence has shown Zimbardo manipulated research parts for his intended results. Remember those interferences I mentioned? Recordings of the experiment revealed that they were more frequent than the professor led us to believe. For example, he encouraged the guards to act in a hostile manner. One of the students who took on the role of a guard said he behaved like an actor because he was led to believe that this was what he was supposed to do during the experiment. Furthermore, an actual former inmate who assisted Zimbardo in the study admitted that it was he who suggested the idea of using a bucket for necessities. Another loose end in the research has to do with the footage. There are only records of 15 out of the 150 hours that the test lasted, which makes a more in-depth peer analysis of what actually happened in this university experiment difficult. And for this reason, in 2006, the BBC funded a new study conducted by British psychologists who replicated the experiment for 8 days, but without the interferences that occurred at Stanford. And this time, the outcome was less alarming, and the guards in fact had difficulty imposing their authority. All this shows that Professor Zimbardo's behavior was far from ethical. Even so, he is still recognized today as one of the most relevant names in psychology of the last century, and this, undoubtedly, is due to the fame that the Stanford prison experiment has gained over the last decades. The case led to documentaries, fiction movies, and even books written by the researcher himself. The work was given the suggestive name of the Lucifer effect, understanding how good people turn evil. The book starts from the events at Stanford, aiming to reflect on what generates evil in people's minds. And then, we return to the question from the beginning of this video. Can a truly good person ever become evil? The search for an answer inevitably leads us to question the question itself. After all, first and foremost, are there truly good people and bad people? This theme has deeply permeated the minds of thinkers for centuries. In the 1700s, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that man is born good and it is society that corrupts him. John Locke advocated for the theory of tabula rasa, the idea that the human mind is like a blank slate and our experiences shape who we will become. Despite the controversies surrounding the Stanford experiment, Zimbardo's work shows that the line separating good and evil is thinner than we might imagine, and that between goodness and wickedness, there exists a gray area that depends on a multitude of factors. After this experiment, psychology itself became more rigorous regarding the ethics of experiments and the way people are studied, precisely to try to influence as little as possible, since all research will have its limitations and interferences. Unlike movies and cartoons, real life is not Manichaean, divided between good and evil. Who guarantees that heroes and villains wouldn't switch roles if they were in each other's shoes? That the criminal who steals at the traffic light wouldn't be a poet if he didn't live amidst inequality? Or that the police officer upholding the law wouldn't become a thief if starving? This goes beyond questioning good or bad, leading us to think about the essence of being human. After all, would you still fundamentally be yourself at any given time, in any conceivable place? Or does the seemingly random location where you were born, at the precise time you existed, define exactly who you are? Are we merely the fruits of our own decisions, or is our identity also significantly shaped by the intricate world around us? These are questions that intersect politics, biology, philosophy, and various other fields of knowledge. We will probably never fully decipher all the variables of the complex equation, whose outcome is our character. But perhaps the page that men and women occupy in history books is determined not only by the choices they made in life, but also by the path that life itself had in store for them on the day and in the place where they were born. Are you really a good person, and would you be in any situation? I would like to know what you think in the comments. Thank you very much, and see you next time.